This experience humanized the enemy, making it far more difficult to sustain the Nazi hatred narrative and forcing them to confront the possibility that their cause was morally bankrupt. The cumulative impact of the material and cultural shock created a profound psychological rift within the POW community. The soldiers, forced to confront a reality that shattered their propaganda-fed beliefs, divided into two distinct, often hostile, factions. The blacks were the fanatical Nazi loyalists, often SS men or fervent members of the Hitler Youth, who maintained their adherence to the ideology through denial and violence. They enforced an internal reign of terror, often assaulting or even murdering fellow prisoners they suspected of becoming Americanized. The whites were the growing majority, moderates and pragmatists who, having witnessed the industrial reality, realized the war was hopelessly lost and were open to democratic influence. This internal conflict was fierce, forcing the U.S. Army to segregate the camps, separating the fanatics from the moderates. This internal struggle was a microcosm of Germany's own eventual ideological defeat. The American system, by simply existing and functioning flawlessly, forced the German prisoners to turn inward and fight the battle for their own future ideology. The camp system effectively became a strategic petri dish for the re-education of post-war German leadership. The U.S. Army, recognizing the intelligence and ideological asset they possessed, formalized the Intellectual Diversion Program, IDP, as a strategic weapon. The goal transcended simple containment. It was a calculated, long-term effort to undermine Nazism and prepare a cohort of future German citizens for democracy. The program focused on separating the fanatical blacks from the receptive whites, ensuring the latter received maximum exposure to non-Nazi ideas. The core was a controlled yet profound curriculum: lectures on American constitutional law, the history of democracy, the mechanics of a free market, and, most devastatingly, uncensored newsreels showing the true, brutal extent of German atrocities, particularly the concentration camps. For many, this was the first time they were forced to confront the moral and political criminality committed in the name of the regime they had served. This intellectual exposure was traumatic and created intense, often violent friction within the camps. The program treated the POWs not merely as captured soldiers, but as future leaders of a new German republic, a strategic, long game that spoke volumes about American confidence in ultimate victory and a commitment to post-war reconstruction. The IDP was a subtle, psychological war waged using truth, education, and the compelling evidence of America's functioning democracy. The ultimate strategic culmination of everything the POWs had witnessed arrived with the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944. Up until this point, the industrial shock was theoretical. D-Day made it an operational, terrifying reality. The POWs were given uncensored maps and news reports detailing the size and scope of the landings. The number of men, ships, planes, and vehicles involved was beyond anything Germany could counter. They understood definitively that every Liberty ship, every Sherman tank, every Jeep, and every round of ammunition they saw reported was sourced from the untouched American factories they had worked in or traveled past. The relentless, massive flow of American resources across the English Channel was the final, inescapable proof that the propaganda was a lie. The German response was visibly paralyzed by the very logistical and industrial deficits the POWs had been observing for years. The inability of the Wehrmacht to move reserves or supplies due to overwhelming Allied air superiority, fueled by American production, confirmed their worst fears. At this moment, the camps transitioned from centers of military confinement to centers of ideological surrender. The war, for them, was officially over, and the realization that the enemy's power was unstoppable led to a rapid, irreversible collapse of morale among the majority. The D-Day invasion was not just a military victory. It was the physical validation of the industrial might they had witnessed being stockpiled around them for years. The final, devastating psychological blow came with the German surrender in May 1945. While the POWs celebrated the end of fighting, the reality of their homecoming was horrifying. They were being repatriated to a homeland that was literally in ruins, its cities flattened, its infrastructure destroyed, and its population facing starvation. They had spent years in America, safe, well-fed, and surrounded by resources. They returned to a world of privation and physical devastation. This contrast was the final, undeniable proof of America's industrial immunity and power. The POWs had lived in the enemy's heartland, a perfectly functioning economy, while their own country was methodically dismantled. This structural reality, that the U.S. fought a total war without enduring any of its domestic costs, was the key lesson they brought home. Their captivity exposed the complete strategic failure of the German High Command, the inability to protect the German homeland, and the simultaneous failure to match the enemy's output. The POWs returned as unwilling evangelists for the truth. America was not beaten by war. It was strengthened by it, achieving a level of production unseen in human history. The German POW experience in the United States became the unacknowledged, long-term propaganda victory of the war. The returning soldiers, the Heimkehrer, the homecomers, carried an undeniable truth. The West was not beaten. The West was overwhelmingly victorious and industrially superior. They had seen the untouched factories, tasted the endless food, and witnessed the resilience of American democracy. Their testimony was instrumental in the rapid and profound rebuilding and denazification of West Germany. Unlike those who had only known Nazi propaganda and the final bitter defeat, the POWs could speak with authority about the true scale of their enemy's power and the functionality of democratic systems. This generation of former soldiers, informed by their time in American custody, became the bedrock of the post-war German-American alliance. They understood that future security lay not in militaristic fantasy, but in democratic stability and industrial cooperation with the West. The POW camp, through its operational efficiency and educational efforts, established a durable ideological bridge, ensuring that the next chapter of German history would be written alongside its former captor. The German POW experience in the United States stands as one of history's most profound lessons in the meaning of total war. The soldiers of the Third Reich were not defeated by a single brilliant tactic or a single unbreakable line. They were defeated by a material flood produced by an opponent that was simply too big, too rich, too secure, and too organized to lose. The laughter of the German pilots who mocked American planes gave way to the solemn, internalized terror of the POWs who witnessed the endless production lines that fed and armed the entire Allied world. Their captivity was a compulsory, years-long tour of the arsenal of democracy. They left America not as defeated soldiers, but as unwilling, informed evangelists for the true scale of American power. Their shock proved that in a war of attrition, geographical immunity, limitless resources, and industrial standardization constitute the ultimate, non-negotiable weapon that ensures victory. The year is 1943. The Third Reich's propaganda machine, helmed by Joseph Goebbels, hammered home a singular, comforting lie. America was a nation of economic fragility and racial decadence, struggling to cope with the demands of total war. This was the worldview carried by hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, Afrika Korps veterans, U-boat sailors, and infantrymen, as they were bundled onto Liberty ships and transported across the Atlantic. Their destination was not a battlefield, but the American heartland. They expected scarcity, hardship, and a nation crumbling under the strain of conflict. What they encountered was a reality so profoundly overwhelming in its abundance, scale, and untouched industrial vigor that it served as the single most effective psychological weapon of the war. This is the definitive account of the 425,000 German prisoners of war, POWs, housed in 511 camps across the American nation. Their captivity was not just physical. It was a profound cognitive defeat, the moment the myth of German technical superiority was extinguished by the terrifying, undeniable truth of American industrial might. They arrived believing they were part of a master race. They left realizing they were pawns, defeated not by courage, but by mathematics and logistics. The very act of their confinement was the first, most brutal lesson in American industrial power. The U.S. managed the logistics of receiving, transporting, housing, and sustaining a captured army equivalent to the population of a major European city, over 425,000 Axis prisoners, all while simultaneously deploying millions of its own troops across 2 global theaters and supplying the Soviet Union and Great Britain. The scale of the POW operation was a testament to the nation's effortless, overwhelming capability. Over 500 main and branch camps were established in 46 states, often built from scratch in remote, nondescript locations with stunning speed. The construction itself was a marvel of resource mobilization. Where German engineers would meticulously plan barracks for years, American standardized construction methods, utilizing prefabricated materials, vast quantities of readily available lumber, and simple, efficient design, erected entire complexes in months. The prisoners observed the seamless logistical chain, the endless trains moving them across the continent, the effortless flow of standardized materials, and the immediate availability of resources like steel and lumber, items that were desperately rationed and sought after in Germany. This operational simplicity, this frictionless flow of resources, spoke volumes. It was the antithesis of the overextended, resource-choked logistics they knew in the Wehrmacht. The speed and ease with which America absorbed this massive administrative burden proved that the nation was not fighting a war of survival, but prosecuting a war of guaranteed volume, where even the management of its enemies was executed with industrial efficiency. This logistical mastery was the silent executioner of German strategic hope, establishing a precedent of overwhelming control. Perhaps the most visceral and immediate shock for the newly arrived POWs was the food. This was where the propaganda met its most complete refutation. Accustomed to the meager, heavily rationed diets of wartime Germany, ersatz coffee, reliance on root vegetables, and extreme scarcity of meat, fats, and sugar, the POWs were stunned by the rations they received. They were provided with a diet that strictly adhered to the Geneva Convention, but by American standards was simply standard fare. Yet, by German standards, it was luxury. Fresh meat, beef, pork, whole milk, real coffee, butter, sugar, and endless supplies of fresh fruit and vegetables were staple items in the mess halls. It is estimated that the POW's per capita calorie intake often exceeded that of the average American civilian, or even frontline German soldier. Many POWs gained significant weight during their internment, a testament to a surplus economy operating at full tilt. The cultural difference was equally impactful. POWs watched American civilians, and even their own guards, casually discard food that German families would have cherished. This wastefulness, observed through the lens of a nation facing total war, was incomprehensible and terrifying. It demonstrated a depth of national wealth and agricultural capacity that made German victory seem utterly impossible. The prisoners realized that while Germany fought a war of scarcity and necessity, America fought a war of limitless, disposable production. The sheer capacity of the American agricultural machine, capable of feeding itself, the military, the Allied nations, lend-lease, and a massive captive population without blinking, was a sign of strategic power far greater than any single weapon. As the POWs traveled by train across the American continent, another crucial, devastating realization dawned. The United States was entirely untouched by the war. Unlike Germany, where major cities like the Ruhr Valley, Hamburg, and Berlin were beginning to crumble under the relentless Allied bombing campaign, every American factory was intact, every rail line functioned perfectly, and every port was operating at maximum capacity. They saw no blackouts, no rationing of electricity beyond minor curtailments, and no fear of air raids. This geographical immunity was the ultimate strategic advantage. The German soldiers, many of whom had seen their own homes and factories devastated by bombs, realized that the source of the Allied power, the factories, the energy grids, the railroads, the shipyards, was completely safe and immune from any German counterattack. This perfect, functioning infrastructure was the bedrock of the war effort. It meant that the American production machine could operate at 100% efficiency, 24 hours a day, without the threat of disruption. The contrast between the untouched American landscape and the ruins of Germany was the final, inescapable truth that stripped away all remaining hope. They realized that while Germany was focused on replacing destroyed capacity, America was focused purely on exponential growth of offensive capacity. This structural security made the prospect of German victory not just unlikely, but mathematically impossible. The sheer size of the American continent added another layer of strategic shock. German soldiers, accustomed to fighting across relatively compact European or North African theaters, were astonished by the vast distances and the seemingly endless resources contained within those borders. Traveling days on end by train, seeing continuous industrial centers seamlessly transition into massive, fertile farmlands, and then into untouched, mineral-rich landscapes, gave them a dizzying sense of scale. They realized that America did not have to import its strategic materials, as Germany did. It simply dug them out of its own backyard. The strategic self-sufficiency of the American industrial base, its control over oil, steel, rubber, and aluminum, was a resource advantage that dwarfed the combined resources of the Axis powers. Furthermore, the sheer scale meant that even if a part of the country faced disruption, which never happened, the remaining regions could easily pick up the slack. This redundancy and depth of resources were the strategic equivalent of a 100-fold force multiplier. The American continent was not just a piece of geography. It was a fortress and an infinitely stocked arsenal, a concept that fundamentally redefined the meaning of a total war for the captive Germans. The most direct and devastating lesson came when the POWs, due to severe wartime labor shortages, were contracted out to work in non-sensitive industrial and agricultural settings. Many of these captured men were highly skilled laborers, former mechanics, engineers, and factory foremen who intimately understood industrial processes. They were absolutely stunned by the American philosophy of production. German industry was founded on high-precision, low-volume craftsmanship. Every weapon or component was a testament to intricate, high-quality, often bespoke engineering. The complex Tiger I tank, requiring thousands of man-hours and specialized alloys, is the ultimate example. American production, however, was ruthlessly focused on simplicity, standardization, and overwhelming volume. The German engineers were shocked by the blinding speed of the assembly lines, the simplicity and universality of the tools, and the seemingly lower initial tolerance of the parts, which were nonetheless produced in astronomical numbers. They realized that the American genius lay not in intricate precision, but in standardization and interchangeability. A POW who had been taught that the complexity of the ME-109 was a sign of superiority now watched the production of thousands of simple, standardized jeeps and trucks that could be repaired anywhere, by anyone, using readily available identical parts. This American commitment to simplicity allowed for rapid scaling and ease of field repair, a strategic advantage that outweighed any tactical superiority the Germans might have briefly possessed. They witnessed their defeat being manufactured by volume, not by elegance. The most compelling illustration of the differing industrial philosophies was in the realm of military transport. The German Wehrmacht relied on a vast array of complex, non-standardized vehicles, often requiring specialized tools and highly trained mechanics for repair, a logistical nightmare in the field. The Americans embraced a radical commitment to standardization, epitomized by the simple, rugged, and endlessly reproducible Jeep and the vast fleets of Dodge and GMC trucks. POWs saw American motor pools holding hundreds of identical, functional vehicles, a resource pool that allowed the Allied forces to absorb catastrophic losses and still maintain momentum. They realized the cost of complexity. Every German truck destroyed meant a crippling logistical delay due to non-standard parts. Every American truck destroyed meant simply replacing it with one of 20 identical replacements. This industrial consistency was the secret to the Allied blitzkrieg. It was the truck, not the tank, that was winning the logistics war, ensuring that fuel, ammunition, and men reached the front lines faster and more reliably than their German counterparts. The German commitment to over-engineered complex masterpieces was an industrial death sentence when confronted with the American commitment to simple, mass-produced resilience. The POWs witnessed the strategic superiority of a standardized, volume-based economy over a precise, custom-engineered one. The prisoners also observed key differences in the labor force, energy consumption, and overall economic health. They were astounded by the massive round-the-clock utilization of energy, the brightly lit factories, the constant hum of machinery, the absence of any power rationing. Germany was perpetually energy-starved. America possessed an apparently infinite supply of power, fueling its relentless, uninterrupted production schedule. Furthermore, they were surprised by the composition and efficiency of the American labor force. They saw women, older workers, and even inexperienced laborers effortlessly operating machinery, a testament to the simplified, standardized nature of the production process. The Nazi propaganda had emphasized the superiority of German skilled labor. The POWs discovered that American mass production required rapid training and simple assembly, allowing the nation to fully mobilize its human capital. This combination of limitless energy, a flexible workforce, and simplified processes was the engine driving the overwhelming material volume that was burying the Axis war effort. The economic efficiency observed by the POWs was a direct refutation of the Nazi economic model, proving that decentralized freedom and efficient labor utilization trumped totalitarian control. The cultural environment of the United States presented a paradox that Nazi ideology was utterly incapable of explaining. Propaganda had described America as a hotbed of moral degeneracy and internal collapse. Yet the POWs witnessed a seemingly cohesive, prosperous, and content society. They were astonished by the accessibility of consumer goods, items that had been unavailable in Germany for years, even before the war. Radios, movies, uncensored magazines, and literature were standard in the camps, exposing the prisoners to a vibrant, multi-layered culture. The freedom of the press was a particularly shocking revelation. Prisoners could read camp newspapers that published objective accounts of the war and the internal situation in Germany, contrasting sharply with the rigidly controlled media environment they had left behind. This freedom of information was the first dose of democratic poison to the Nazi worldview, allowing the prisoners to formulate their own non-ideological conclusions about the war's progress. The seemingly carefree attitude of the American population, their casual wealth, and their lack of rigid class structure completely undercut the Nazi emphasis on strict social hierarchy and military control. The POWs realized their enemy's decadence was simply prosperity and freedom, attributes that were generating overwhelming, unstoppable military power. The personal interactions between the prisoners, their guards, and the civilian population provided the deepest level of psychological challenge. Unlike the brutalization and hostility that characterized German treatment of Soviet POWs, the American approach was often characterized by professionalism and sometimes surprising casualness. Guards adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention, ensuring humane treatment, clean facilities, and adequate medical care, a level of decency many prisoners would not have expected. More confusingly, in agricultural areas, the German POWs often worked directly with American farmers and local communities. The farmers, seeing the prisoners as temporary labor to solve a wartime shortage, often treated them as employees rather than despised enemies. They exchanged small tokens, offered minor treats, and engaged in casual conversation. This absence of deep ideological hatred was completely disarming and contradicted the Nazi narrative of American hostility. The POWs observed the personal freedoms and the relative lack of fear among the American public, confirming that the war was not touching the core of American life.